unenviable task of running this final session here. I think I see my task as, firstly, trying to keep you awake, and secondly, trying to manage this illustrious panel here and make sure that they don't speak for 20 to 30 minutes each. Because I really think we're past that. At this stage, that's not what we can handle, and it would be very good. It would be very good to hear from all of these people, of course, but it would also be very nice to have a few minutes at the end to hear some questions and to sum it up. I don't think we can make this into the grand panel that finally defines the writing of the history of the global.
I don't mind being shut up for drinks.
Me too. Okay, so I'm going to take that very seriously, and I will shut them up, and I will tell them when they've spoken for 8 minutes, and they cannot go over 10. So I'm hoping for 5.
Economic historian.
Okay, and I've also been given a running order, which is not the order on the sheet, and it's also not the order they're sitting in. But I will introduce them each, and I think we will start with Professor Darwin.
Thank you. I'm going to exceed my target and aim for 4 or perhaps 3. Well, I must say, in the first session yesterday, I did indeed feel as somebody who'd committed a meta-narrative, rather like an MP who'd been sent to go and live amongst honest people. But as the day went on, I suppose one began to recover a certain amount of nerve about this. What I thought, I suppose, I learned particularly from, or was reassured by, or perhaps was encouraged by in the course of the discussion, was the way in which the study of global history was defined as being, and I draw really, I suppose, particularly upon what Ken Pomerantz was saying, upon the study of divergence and also difference. And I was also, I think, felt warmly towards Jan de Vries's insistence that we shouldn't regard the world as being flat or monochrome. So the question is, if that's the field which one is trying to study, I mean, the study of divergence and difference, how should one go about it? And I suppose what emerged, there was one striking absence perhaps, but I suppose what emerged in a way were some of the usual suspects by way of method, systematic comparison, very much in my mind, because in that review article which Prasannan mentioned, I suppose you could sum up the report of the reviewer by saying, must learn to concentrate. Perhaps a less demanding school would suit him better. A report which brought back floods of memories. But there was the question of systematic comparison. But I suppose, although it's easiest to think of that as being done in the study of the history of material, or shall we say, of material wealth, it's rather harder to see how one might do that, again, systematically, if one looked at all the other areas of human activity, whether constructing legal regimes, constructing forms of government. It's perhaps in terms of economic performance, it's easiest, and indeed not easy even then, to think of doing systematic comparisons. The real problem, it seems to me, about that is that once you have got your enormous data bank of systematic comparisons, suitably, as it were, footnoted, what do you do with it? And if you're trying to explain difference, particularly divergence, which of these various, as it were, elements in your systematic comparison are you going to actually privilege or treat as being more important or less important than the others, or are they all going to be of equal importance, in which case you've learned rather little? I suppose the way of going about global history, which was perhaps slightly absent in our discussions, although, of course, it was mentioned in terms particularly of the Industrial Revolution, is the study of macro processes. I mean, we didn't hear much about the gunpowder revolution, we didn't hear about decolonization, we didn't hear about revolutions. Oh, we had a revolution, I suppose we did, didn't we? But not an awful lot. Again, I suppose, although you might well imagine organizing the study of global history around macro processes, some of the same objections apply. I mean, which ones are you going to treat as being really seminal, dominating, powerful? Which ones are you going to actually treat as being less so? And indeed, how many macro processes are you actually going to put on the table? Because actually the list really perhaps could be endless. Thirdly, of course, there's a very favoured way of studying global history, and we've heard a lot about that, and that is in terms of regions. Of course, that's, I think, an approach which one is bound to have enormous sympathy with, because it's produced so much brilliant, interesting, imaginative work. I suppose, nevertheless, one is conscious of some of the difficulties about that, highlighted by a marvellous, I thought, scorching review by the Canadian historian Ian Steele of Bernard Bailyn's account of Atlantic history, which Steele characterized as being little more than US history writ large. But Steele's main objection was that in constructing a region, particularly the kind that Balin did, that the key, as it were, elements of that region which gave people identity, i.e. their imperial subjecthood, had simply been left out mysteriously in Balin's Atlantic history. So I think, although we might be very favourable towards the idea of connecting up, as it were, different parts of some designated region, and again, what is a region? What is a region? Very hard to decide what a region is. Nevertheless, I think we need to be cautious about not overlooking or simply sidelining what may be to the people of the time their strongest sense of, especially political, maybe even also cultural identity. Then, of course, there's the other, I suppose, currently one of the most popular ways of studying global history, which is through transactions of various kinds, and that's to say, the movement of goods, ideas, and people. But again, I think my restraint on that, am I near the end of time? No. My restraint on that might come from, again, I think, important objection raised by Ken Pomeranz, and that is, of course, for most of the time, people don't move around, ideas may, but even then, perhaps a lot of ideas don't move around that much either, or not that rapidly. What conclusions can one draw? Well, I suppose perhaps three, really. One is, I have a lot of sympathy, I'm going back to the first session, with what Linda Colley had to say. I mean, I think that there are many ways, you might say, of skinning this particular cat. And there's no, it seems to me, there's no monopoly on the right way of going about global history. We're bound to be extremely pluralistic. And until somebody discovers cleverer methodologies to link up the various areas in which we work in than we have at present, I think that's bound to happen for quite a long time to come. Secondly, I suppose my conclusion would be that although meta-narratives perhaps are rather annoying things, nevertheless, we probably do need to have them for a little while. Well, perhaps we will always need to have something, if only to reassure the great British and international public that we're not simply burrowing away in our own rather small warrens of academic activity, but are actually saying something which they might possibly be able to hang on to and understand. But my third conclusion would be, I suppose, that probably the amount of work being done of a much more detailed and indeed, dare I say, systematic kind does mean that those meta-narratives that are produced will go out of date much more rapidly perhaps than in the past. And of course that's something which one can only be delighted at. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm stunned. That was perfect timing. So we'll be reading right through this. This is great. So I now pass over to Professor Vaughan, and you will need to speak in the microphone.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. All my colleagues were here, so I had to stay in Cambridge because somebody had to teach. So, and I'm really sorry I missed that. So I'm not actually really going to refer very much to the proceedings of yesterday. Is that working? Yeah. A bit closer. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. I'm going to say a little bit about Africa because I'm told that Africa is a big black hole in global history. A couple of weeks ago, I watched I think it was a BBC television programme, anyway, a UK television programme, which was on the origins of humankind and featured an extremely engaging and extremely enthusiastic young biological anthropologist who went to a rather godforsaken place in Ethiopia, which apparently is where we all came from. It was very dry and dusty, and she marvelled at the fact that we all originated in this place and that we were all Africans, actually. And then the rest of the programme was describing how we got out of there in great detail. So it very much left us with a feeling, or left me with a feeling, that the human origins are in Africa, but human history begins when we swim over that little bit of the Red Sea and start making our way out. So those who were left behind did not feature in this programme at all. So the African continent was the beginning and the end of the story of African history. And I was rather struck. I wasn't able to see the next programme actually, which was billed as being able to explain to us why, although we originated in Africa, we didn't look like Africans any longer. Anyway, why is it that Africa is a bit of a black hole in this current wave of global history? I think, I don't really have an answer to that, but I have a couple of suggestions. One is about global inequalities in the very presentist sense. If you know anything about the funding of higher education and education in Africa, you won't need me to explain that in great deal of detail, but it's just to say that the reproduction of historians, and particularly, I suppose, of economic historians, somewhere like in most parts of Africa, though not everywhere, is at a very low ebb. The other reason, though, I think, is a more long-term structural reason, and I think arises out of the fact that Africa's role in the period of Western industrialization, and I know this is not supposed to be the only narrative of global historians, but it is still a very dominant narrative. Africa's role was as a supplier of labour, and that seems to have brought us to a kind of full stop, as if there is nothing more to be learned from that. It was not a supplier of manufactured goods. We didn't use African porcelain. It was a supplier of labour. Let me just go on to say a little bit about where I think there might be some possibilities for further interaction between historians of Africa and global historians, but also what I think the limits of that are, or the dangers of that are. I have a colleague in Cambridge who's always accusing me of being parochial because I study Africa, and I find that rather irritating. We, historians of Africa from the 60s to the present day, have spent an awful lot of time protesting too much, I think, that we also have dense webs of trading networks, and we also have cities, and we also have all of those things. And I think we need to step back from that a bit, important as it is. There are very good reasons why we moved inland in the 1970s from the coasts to the interior. And that is because not everything was happening on the coasts. Global history, as it's written in relation to Africa, is literal and literate in its bias, and I must say a bit masculine as well. I mean, it seems to involve people getting on boats quite a lot, so it is implicitly intercontinental, I think. And if you look at a vast continent like Africa, you can make a very, very powerful case for vast historically significant changes taking place within the continent that transform the continent in all sorts of ways. And yet these would not count as global history because they are happening within the continent. And I think there's a sort of implicit, although we talk about intercultural contact when we talk about global history and contact zones in a cultural sense, I think there is an implicit racial kind of characterization going on here, which is if it's Africans moving around in Africa, that doesn't count as anything which is intercultural. And I think that is something we really need to look at again. And to echo something that has already been said, I think we also need to look at our metaphors. The metaphors of global history, the metaphors of change, of movement, of all those metaphors which the we is problematic here, but I think we find quite attractive. And it's interesting to me the way those metaphors make their own journey into description, and then I think sometimes even into explanation if we're not careful. And there is a case, I think, for looking at stasis and for looking at slow accretions of historical change, which take place in some parts of Africa and I think are highly significant. Having said all of that, I think there is a huge potential for, particularly in the field of comparative history, for more work on Africa. And I am a little baffled as to why more of that doesn't go on. I mean, we do need more Pomerantian accounts of Africa, and we do actually have quite a sophisticated literature by economic historians and economic anthropologists about systems of exchange, value, the meanings of a very, very very sophisticated literature on West Africa about the relationship between indigenous systems of value and imported systems and so on, which really, and although we don't have great demographic data, we do also have enough to begin to have a conversation, if you want to have that kind of conversation, which is comparative. I think that comparative conversation has to be both within the African continent, because we can learn a great deal about historical change in the long term by looking at regions within Africa, but also potentially between regions in Africa and regions in, say, Central Asia. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My job turns out to be very easy. That's wonderful. So far.
The worst is yet to come.
Right, so now we move to Professor Billy So, who's here from the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Yeah, so far so good. Now it's the turn to the story. It's becoming a ritual that I have to thank Maxine and her team. I'm very honored to be invited to attend this conference and say a few words on that round table. I've been engaging in researches related to connectedness and comparison of different societies, cultures, at different periods of time in history. I never participate in any project of writing of the global per se. So I took this opportunity to learn from the inspiring works of many of the speakers of this conference and to reflect on my own scholarship. As a result, I'm able to appreciate a lot more the profound meaning of global history as a new field in history, as well as its immense complexity. Now, being attracted to this discourse, I've been developing a writing project with a colleague at George Mason University, where I'm spending my sabbatical. We have come up with some conceptual reflections pertaining to global history, and we try to elaborate those ideas in greater details in the form of a paper to submit to the conference this summer. Now, making use of these 10 minutes or so, less than 10 minutes, I would like to just spell out some sort of fundamentals of our paper for discussion. Now, to begin with, the issue we try to deal with is identity in global history, which might make the title of our paper. In a nutshell, the paper will examine the theoretical and methodological meanings of identity as a concept in the discourse of global history. And it concludes by proposing the use of identity as an alternative and supplemental unit of analysis in global history, and suggests more attention to the individual's global identity, in addition to that of identities in many other forms of social grouping or collective. The theme of our paper is hence about individuality in a global context. Now, briefly speaking, our paper will start with the globalization of the discourse of this newly emerging field of global history. Taking on board the complex controversies and divergent views, either positive or negative, concerning it as a new field of academic inquiry, against the long-existing fields of world history, national history, regional histories, and local histories, among many other branches in historiography. We will move on to note the role of individual in various historical writings in the form of biography of the heroes, the famous, the ordinary, and the privileged, and so on and so on. And that's the same level of attention to the individuals or of individuality itself is not yet witnessed in the very robust discourse of global history. We then analyze the concept of identity by distinguishing individual identity and individual's identity. Now, the former, individual identity, represents a sense of belonging to a particular kind of social grouping that defines we-they relations. The latter, the individual's identity, or the identity of the individual, implies the intentional or unintentional choice of an individual to identify himself or herself among a bundle of multiple identities open to her or him. Now, we call this individual's identity his or her manifest identity that forms the single most important identity to that individual in a particular circumstance. And note that this manifest identity can be switching to other temporarily latent identities in other circumstances. Now, the bundle of identities from which an individual might choose as a manifest individual's identity in history might not include an individual identity that carries a global meaning. In the past 2 decades or so, due to the rapid development of information technology like internet and so on, we might argue that there are more and more individual identities going to be immersed in the global context, and hence, sooner or later, any individual identity will carry a global implication. But historically speaking, it might not be the case. There were historically exist notions of identity without being affected by a sense of globalism induced from connections and comparison with other parts of the world. The key difference between individual identity with a global dimension or that without a global dimension, for example, the identity of a wife in a family, seems to lie in whether or not the relevant knowledge of the others is a variable, and if a variable, whether or not it is taken into account. In this sense, individual identity of the global dimension might exist even long before the information age or modern era. The only difference is the scope of spread and accessibility of this globalized knowledge pertaining to an individual identity. Now, we can therefore talk about a globalized identity of the wife, for example. In the 16th century Chinese maritime entreport with frequent contact and strong connection with Japan, Southeast Asia, and even Europe, which was differentiable from that in an inland Chinese city with little connection with other countries or cultures. Now, it goes without saying that the globalization of identity-related information has been changing over time following expansion of economic, cultural, and political powers across oceans and continents. And that has been detailed largely in world history. So the question is, what do we mean by identity as a unit of analysis in global history? Our paper will address this question by looking into the major categories of individual identity in a global context. Now, these will include political identity, geographical identity, gender identity, professional identity, religious identity, ethnic identity, taste and style identity, economic identity, class identity, education identity, and value identity, or many others. Now, all will be examined in a light of a global context. This discussion will lead to an exploration of a new kind of individual identity with specific attributes which we might theoretically associate with the global context becoming a variable to the individuals to choose from within their bundles of identities. Now, we will call this identity the global identity, which is differentiable from other identities in the global context. Now, let me outline some of these salient features, for example, by way of a contrastive description as the following. Global identity represents an individual's identity rather than a collective identity. It cannot be convincingly used as an identity basis for global governance or world government because global identity is based on commonality but not cohesiveness. Global identity is transnational, trans-regional, translocal. It is therefore not serving the purpose of a new political or geographical division on Earth. Global identity is nurtured, aroused, and reinforced by a global narrative in much the same way as a national or community identity is nurtured, aroused, and reinforced by a national or community narrative. Global identity is transcultural and culturally transformative. It is therefore not culturally bounded and entrenched. Cultural identity is difference-conscious and difference-sensitive, but not difference-oriented as other collective identities like national or cultural identities. It is therefore difference-accommodating and difference-bridging by nature. The cultural identity is inclusive, diversity-inclined, and heterogeneous instead of exclusive, conforming, and homogeneous. Cultural identity, global identity is not an outcome of ignorance of others, but rather is derived from and maintained by global information of others. It happened historically only in certain communities where such information was accessible, but made possible to increasingly more people on Earth by ever advancing in information technology and education globalization. Global identity is not independent and alienable from national, regional, local, communal, and other culturally embedded identities. It is built upon the meanings and information of these categories and exists within the bundle of identities a person may encounter, and is but one of the many choices a person might make as one's manifest identity in particular circumstances. Global identities can enrich the context of national, regional, local, communal, and other culturally embedded identities. It may not and should not suppress their meanings, contents, and heritages. Now, after describing global identity in such a schema, we suggest that global identities is identifiable as one of the individual's identity in the genres of oral history, biography, and autobiography. In this sense, we follow the call of the first speaker of yesterday's conference, Linda Corey, to explore the great potential of the transcultural biographies of individuals. Now, understandably, it does not imply that all individuals' narratives must have been showing a global identity as described above. In fact, many biographies have only treated individuals in the national context or some other forms of context like gender or whatever, without much implication of a global context. In short, what we try to suggest is the writing of an alternative global history through an alternative and supplemental units of analysis in the identity of the individual. And it might be accomplished through the oral history of an individual or in the form of a biography and autobiography. Thank you.
I think that is a halfway applause. We'll give you a proper applause later. Right, so we've now been to Oxford and to Cambridge and to Hong Kong, and now we move to Vienna. Professor Theo Vries will talk to us next.
Yeah. I've seen my colleague Sefket constantly deleting all kinds of text. I hope I managed to make him delete the last 3 sentences that are left. I already looked at them. I will present some general reflections, and as you all know, reflections are not total reflections, very often are personal, and normally they are somewhat distorted, but I have some comments of which I think they could be useful. The first thing is, I was struck by the fact that basically we did not talk so much about writing of the global, but much more about research. And as we all know, especially when we're interested in the philosophy of history, the distinction between research and writing is enormous. It takes me always far longer to write something down than to find something out. We could have focused somewhat more on how do you do this? And there I think we could have reflected a little bit more on the past of the field, because it's indeed the case that it's not all totally new. Global history is not something of the last years. We should not make the mistake the Germans make, who constantly reflect on what people did, and they take it so far that they never do anything original themselves. You have to pass beyond that, but we are a little bit without any tradition whatsoever. I'm half German. But it's a tradition. I go to many German conferences. It's an enormous tradition of historiography that sometimes really hinders the development of the field. But I think in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, historiography is a little bit underdeveloped. The second point we could reflect a little bit more on is why exactly we do it. Patrick O'Brien referred to it, and I think you cannot do something in a decent way if you're not convinced that it's useful, and if you do not really know why you would want to do it. There could be a couple of different ways to legitimize it. The first one would be the moral way, that you have to know things about other people. It's indecent to not know things about other people. It's not fair. The second thing, which is connected to it, you could say, because of globalization, you have to know some things about these other people, because it's not only unfair not to know something about them, but they're also here, or you are there, so it becomes impractical. For me, the main reason to do global history will be the globe exists. from a scholarly perspective, it's very weird to have a discipline, let's say natural science, that says we only do 10% of nature because the rest of nature is someplace else. It would be strange. The history as a scholarly discipline should try and have a laboratory that's as big as possible. Every case that can add something to what we know, every case that can be connected or can be compared, has a value as such from a scholarly perspective. Which of course brings you to the point, why would we do it? Two ways of doing it have been presented. One way is what you could call a little bit overdoing it, presentism, in which you say, basically we want to know how we got where we are. I think that's an extremely important reason to do global history, and that in the last instance would lead to a kind of what Patrick always calls a kind of meta-narrative, that you say behind all the stories there's one big story and we happen to be at the end of it. And on purpose say happen to be on the end of it. It can change and tomorrow you can write another story. The other one would of course be to say we have to respect the entire past, we should do everything, and then you get the problem of big history, or the invention of big history. Should global history really try to encompass as much as possible? And I think as an ideal we should do it, but in practice it's not possible, so we should reflect somewhat more, and I missed that, on what would be relevance, what would be the category of relevance in global history. Everyone who teaches, I once gave a lecture, I got 400 euros for it, in 45 minutes, a brief history of the world. It's possible, it has not been published for very good reasons, but it's possible. But you have to think about relevance, and I think we could have done it a little more. Another point that's interesting is the public and the audience. For whom are we doing this? Would a global history in Austria be the same as a global history in Turkey or as a global history in Brazil? From what perspective do we do it? In what language do we do it? And there it's still fairly clear that global history as we do it here is Anglo-Saxon. It's done in English. It has a specific set of problems. I don't know the solution, but I hear from many people outside the global history field that they think it's an Anglo-Saxon bulwark. Whatever you think. A next point we should try and discuss is professionalization. Of course, all these things have been discussed, but many people attack us that saying that global history is not a real discipline. You could be thinking about what is source criticism in global history. I've encountered this comment hundreds of times. People say global history is not a real historical discipline because you do not read original sources. And of course it's true, but when you read original sources you don't write big synthesis, and big synthesis is what very often is expected of global history. So is there something like source criticism in which you say I read 1,000 books, or 500 or 8, and then I write a synthesis? How can you do this in a correct way? I think there are standards, just as there are standards for journalism, but we should discuss more what would be a good way to synthesize, what would be a good way to discuss things on a level where you don't go to the sources themselves, but have a friend, for example, who does it for you. But how do these things work? And this is very important because if you want to really create a discipline of global history, and I think this is really a major point, you will be judged on your professional status and who is going to pay for the history of the past of the world. In the Netherlands you can by and large only get money for something the Dutch did, the Dutch are related to, but who is going to pay the past of the world? The enthusiasm is not fanatic, so to say. And if you look at the attention to global history, we of course are global historians and we think it increases, but a student of mine did research and he said in schools it decreases. The attention to Dutch history is increasing, and the Netherlands is such an enormously small country. When they manage to get more and more interest in themselves, we are in big trouble as global historians. But the last 20 years it decreased. It's really fascinating. So we have to, if we want to professionalize it, we have to be at certain places where the money is, where the textbooks are made, where the school programs are organized. Otherwise we will be a mutual admiration society, at least most of us. What is global history about? I think we agree it's about, could be about commonalities, what all people in the world share as a basic challenge. I think you could write interesting books about that. How do people organize a polity? How do people organize whatever kind of problem, ecological problems? There are universal problems. How do we deal with it? The other one is, of course, comparison. And the last one is connections. And I have the impression that connections is the most favorite at the moment. And there I was struck, and I referred to this yesterday when I was talking about reasons. There I was struck by the fact that it's rather cozy. 2 minutes left, that's not a problem. It's rather cozy. Networks are very often presented as if there's not someone who's profiting more than someone else. I think the role of power should be much more confronted in global history. There is an element of disequilibrium, there is an element of manipulation, there is an element of power, and not every network is to everyone's advantage. And then I come to the last comment I want to make, and I also made it yesterday. I know that many global historians do a lot of things with the state, but in the way in which global history talks about the state, it's always about transnationalism, getting rid of the state, no longer looking at the state so much. I think it would be enormously important to turn the state into a specific kind of region and then take it on board in global history. If you don't do that, I think, at least for modern history, you miss out on quite a lot of things. I've got 1 second left.
Are you going to, I thought you were going to use your 1 second. He's given it away. You're done. Okay, wonderful. Right, so now we move on to the people with the dual affiliations. And Professor Diogo Ramada Puta is from the University of Lisbon and University College. Oh, King's College. What? Who did this? Okay. So over to you.
Well, I would like to stress some considerations around 4 points, and only 4 points. The first thing that I'd like to say is about this celebration of these 10 years of this group of economic historians. And the thing that strikes me mostly is the openness to ideas and to the different considerations of the cognitive component of action, to use Linda Colley's expression, or the different discussions that we have been developing around ideas that were embodied, the globalization of ideas. The first thing that really was globalized was imagination, to return to Chris Bailey's argument. I thought that this kind of multiple layer history goes back, in fact, to the first project of the Annales School, and mostly to the project that was launched by Lucien Febvre in 1922 when he published La Terre, l'évolution de l'humanité. And this is something that leads me to a kind of French optimism, in contrast with my friend Jean-Frédéric Chaud yesterday, where I noticed a certain French pessimism. So I think that there is a return to a global project of Histoire Totale, and I would like to know more about the difference between the kind of Histoire Totale articulated with the global history that this specific group is trying to do, with the old French project initiated by Febvre and developed by Brodel and many others. The second point that I would like to stress is a certain tension, but at the same time a certain movement from modernization and the rise of the West, or the much more useful concept of great divergence, from modernization to big processes in time. And I think that the conference was also, I know that some people stressed mostly the changes that happened during the 18th century or at the end of the 18th century, around that turning point of 1800. But in a series of papers from De Vries to Wong, I notice an openness to, and also to the question raised by Obsbaum, I noticed a pressure to go deeper in time, and I think that the relation between agrarian civilizations and pastoralist societies was, for instance, one of the points in De Vries and Wong, and it was also present in the chart of history by Priestley that refers and gives a large space to the Tartars. And in fact, I mean, at least during the early modern period, the Tartars occupied a huge space in terms of reflection, not only from the point of view of Europeans, but also from the point of view of the Chinese in terms of consideration of these pastoralist societies. And I think that we reached a certain climax of this demand for a big process, precisely when Megan Vaughan suggested a kind of new interpretation of Africa from the point of view of Pomerance. I think that this is a very challenging aspect in order to cover not only the last 200 years, but big processes of civilization, big process also of modernization that are not necessarily identified with the industrialization. The third point that I'd like to stress is, again, about the micro-macro link. And I think that here different interpretations and different references came out during the conference about the local and the global, about the importance of texts raised by Sanjay in relation to the global, about biography and biography of marginal people and a globalized world, about regions, the local and the global, and the need to articulate all these scales of analysis. And I would like to say two things about this. The first is, depending on the scale of analysis, I think that we should consider different forms of conceptualization, because the philological interpretation of the text, for instance, leads to a certain kind of interpretation and to a certain kind of conceptualization, I guess, with a certain number of limits. And when we move to another scale of analysis, another kind of conceptualization, another kind of ideal types should be developed. The second thing that I would like to say about this micro-macro link is that this is not a new question, for sure. I mean, Brodel was facing precisely the criticisms of the figure of the bricolayer when he was publishing his own stuff by Lévi-Strauss. MacNeill was not very popular perhaps at his time in Chicago. Much more impact came from the works of Marshall Salins, working in a smaller scale. At the end of the 50s, from Isaiah Berlin, later on to Gombrich, but mostly around Karl Popper, and a more fragmentary way of proceeding in terms of scientific history was opposed by people like Karl Wittfogel, interested in global things and in opposing to global interpretations, in his case to the Marxist interpretations, denunciations in the global scale. So I think that in order to control the relation between the macro-micro link, we should also go back to the history of this kind of debate, as in a different way, Schaeffer was saying about the history of science. And the last point that I would like to raise goes back to something that was raised just in the beginning by David Washbrook, which is related with our moral responsibilities and our moral duties in terms of our own values in relation to our ways of conceptualizing history. In his opinion, and several people took the same expression from John Darwin to Pierre Vriers, when we conceptualize history in terms of connections, movements, and circulation of people, we are putting aside something that is more related with exploration, coercion, the role of the state, and violence. And I think that this is a complicated issue that we should take on board, and we also should take on board, for instance, in order to give another example of the kind of moral responsibility that we have, that when we are quoting Crosby's book and the importance of this biological impact, we should also consider the book that was dedicated to criticize Crosby's book by David Arnold, where the issue of moral responsibility comes out. So these are more my 4 points regarding this wonderful conference. I think that if I wanted to summarize what I have learned, I would say that what I have learned is about the writing of the global history through a certain number of divergences. I think that this is the only consensus that we can generate, that in order to write world history, we should oppose ideas, and we should also take on board different kinds of oppositions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diogo. So now to our final speaker, who's going to pull all this together. And that's from both, right? Boğaziçi University in Istanbul and the London School of Economics.
Well, that's not precisely what I bargained for when I agreed to be on this panel. At the end of 2 very intensive days, well, what is there really left to say? I would like to begin by repeating something that has been already said. I would like to express our gratitude to Maxine for bringing us together on this wonderful occasion. Like many of you, I have learned a great deal. This has been, for me, a lot more than a social occasion to see dear friends, but also 2 days of intense learning. I'm an economic historian. I have worked on both comparisons and connections, so I can say I'm a card-carrying member of the club. I have worked on the history of prices and wages, on issues of divergence and convergence, trade history, monetary history, more recently on the history and political economy of economic institutions, especially fiscal institutions. And most of my work has been on the early modern era, but I've also written on both the earlier and later periods. And I have worked mostly on a region or on regions that I should emphasize have been underrepresented in these 2 days, perhaps not represented at all. This is the region, depending on where you are situated, this is the region of Middle East or West Asia and Southeastern Europe. And I've also worked to a lesser extent on economic history of Europe. As Janet Abulugoddo had argued some time ago, in the period up to 1500, perhaps even to 1600 or 1650, this region or regions not only experienced an efflorescence, to use Jack's term, of its own, but it also served to bring East Asia and Europe together. I just want to remind you of a seminal book by Andrew Watson on the transmission of different crops across Eurasia during the medieval period, and it was ultimately the expansion of Islam through this geography that brought these two regions together. And if you really look for connections, there are plenty of connections. And just as another illustration, I want to remind you of a lesser known connection, and this is something that has been unearthed recently, of the triangle of trade and payments between, say, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Scandinavia during the Middle Ages. This is a most unlikely connection, but there is now enormous evidence of the minting of very, very large amounts of silver coinage in the Middle East, and the trade with Central Asia and trade with Scandinavia, and the Vikings were actively involved in this trade, and a good part of these specie movements ended up in medieval Europe, just as a very important example of the linkages, of the connections, and of course also linkages in many other ways. In these last 2 days, we've talked about what is and what should be global history. We've talked about what are and what should be the methodologies of global history. What are and what should be the units or subunits of global history. And we've also talked about what are and what should be the objects of global history. I don't have either the time or the courage to comment at length on these, but I would like to appeal modestly for a particular agenda here. This has been raised a number of times in the last 2 days. We have so far focused on trade, circulation of commodities, transmission of technology, knowledge, and many other issues, objects of global history. But it seems to me, especially because of its rising importance in economic theory in the last 2 decades, one thing global history needs to take more seriously is the history of institutions and the transmission of institutions. Now, obviously, trade involves flows of commodities, brings people together, leads to exchange of ideas, but trade also leads to exchanges of practices and institutions. I would like to remind you, for example, that there is a debate, not necessarily conclusive, about the transmission, or let's say, at the very least, about the interaction between the southern half of the Mediterranean and the northern half of the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages, about the evolution of partnerships between the Islamic Mudaraba and the European Commenda. This is it's an inconclusive debate, but I think it's a very critical and very exemplary debate about how important the transmission, how important and how complicated the transmission of institutions can be over time. It requires comparisons, but it also requires a much nuanced detail of the mutual influences. In many ways, this agenda for history of institutions requires micro-study, It requires philology. We talked about this. And, but in the long run, these institutions are at the root, we have been told by economic theory, are at the root of many of the divergences we have been talking about. I would like to end by going back to the beginning, to Patrick O'Brien's comments and his question yesterday about how global history should be written. I think he personally asked many of us, how would you write global history? And at the end of the 2 days, I would say I would make it more inclusive, both temporally. Okay? I would focus beyond the early modern period, extended certainly to the modern period, but also extended back to the millennia earlier. I would make it more inclusive spatially. After all, I think if this is a response to Eurocentrism, it should not be an enterprise limited to the comparison of East Asia and Europe. It should be more pluralist, and I would point out in this respect to a very successful, in my view, economic history of Europe textbook written by Ivan Berendt, which successfully combines very different parts of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries into a single narrative. I would also, last but not least, emphasize that states should be part of global history one way or another, especially interstate systems of different regions. I think that was one of those things that was missing in the last 2 days. Thank you very much.
Well, so now we have 10 minutes left. I think we need to use that time efficiently so that we can have our drinks at 5:30. So can I remind you, you will need the microphone. And can you please start by saying who you are? But if you keep your questions short, then more people will be able to say something. So there's a question here.
Geoffrey Hosking, University College London. Two people raised the question why we should do global history, and let me try and give one immediate reason, which is that we're living through a major crisis of globalization right now. Nuclear proliferation, a financial crisis, an economic crisis, climate change, terrorism, human trafficking. These are all things which have come upon us in some ways unexpectedly, but one task of global history is undoubtedly to explain how we got into this mess, possibly to indicate ways in which we might get out of it. The other thing I wanted to say, and I'd like a response, if possible, from the panel, is it seems to me we should have been saying more about religions in relation to globalization. Major religions have a view of globalization and of connectedness among different peoples. They have a view of the individual and his or her relationships to community, and that involves usually some kind of law and morality. And these are stable factors which help people to make relationships with one another, including people whom they don't know and who come from strange cultures. Religions also create their own trust networks, but equally they create rigid borders of distrust. Both of those are crucial for understanding the way in which global economic relationships have evolved. So those are the things that I would like to add into the debate, perhaps this too late stage.
So we'll collect a few more questions. There are two here that I have. So somebody?
Actually, it turns out I have a slightly different take. I agree with what was just said, that we need to, and I mentioned this before as well yesterday, perhaps take the issue of religion more seriously than we have. But I am not at all sure actually that the best way of doing it is to think about religions as creating, rigid borders and things of this kind. In fact, I would particularly want to invite a comment from Shafkat Bey about the problem of actually how a certain type of global history has, in fact, curiously reinforced certain kinds of cliches. For example, about how Islam is responsible for certain kinds of massive failures. Where there are arguments, which are actually very long-standing arguments about incompatibility of Islam and capitalism, say, or how profit-making institutions are impossible inside of Islam, which have been given a release of life again by people writing in prestigious journals like the Journal of Economic History. I was actually wondering, in some sense, whether this actually raises the problem of how one actually deals with religion in the context of a global history without resorting once more to some kind of fairly crude form of Weberian sort of civilizational logic where, this is the way in which you characterize particular parts of the world, in particular civilizational areas in terms of values which don't need to be investigated, but where they become a kind of residual cultural dumping ground for any kind of explanation that one wants to attribute. So I would actually like you to tell us, you mentioned that Islam was not very much present in this discussion. How was the Middle East?
I think we'll take a few more questions, and then I think all we have time for is one response in a minute. So, Bin?
Yeah, Bin Wong, UCLA. Following up both of those two comments, it seems to me, and I want to relate this, I'll make two comments. One is, one way to understand, or I would interpret Sanjay's intervention and request, can be related back to a larger tension between what we think of as theory and what we think of as data. The joke about economists that I learned when I studied economics 4 years ago is that I tell others from an applied person and a theorist. A theorist is a person with his interest in data, gets a data set, and tests it, and it doesn't work, he looks for another set of data. I mean, the theory stands no matter what. And that joke, not that I'm violent, but the joke matters in the sense that the danger of some of the theories, and I want to speak specifically to the new institutionalism, is the degree to which the propositions in new institutionalism can be separated from the empirical examples that give it its motive force. So is Doug North right, and everyone who follows Doug, that a particular set of institutions, namely Anglo institutions, that are coterminous with a particular episode type of approach, by definition define what are the efficient institutions? That's a very difficult thing to establish empirically. And because we easily conflate the case that empirically informs the general theory, we don't discriminate well enough between institutions empirically and what conceptually and theoretically would actually motivate them. The other comment I wanted to make was that in the various things we've been talking about between macro and micro and the way causality works at these different levels, it seemed to me in part was inspired by one of the comments Ken was making. And then also, Jan Loken's not with us, in his references to development economics. There's been a move in economics, if you think of the emergence of development economics, it's very much predicated on the notion that we know how to make development. So what has happened is that conceptually our explanations of the past have been transformed into notions of what we can do and therefore agency, deliberate action. And that's deeply different from explaining economic patterns in the past, which if we distinguish between micro and macro, the role of unintended consequences, the notion of what individual agency means, and distinguishing why an agent does something from the consequences of such actions when put within a larger structural context. These things have to be clearly distinguished. We've collapsed them in the way we've developed economics to our detriment, and therefore we need to be more able to distinguish that. And I will close just by saying that's an example analytically of a kind of problem, it seems to me, that is clearest in economics because ultimately economics is, in its propositions, is very simple. The problem is much more difficult than other areas.
I think Professor Flynn over there, behind you.
Dennis Flynn. We'll try to keep this as short as possible. When we talk about connections in economic history in particular, 99.9% of the connections have to do with trading items. And I'm going to, just like yesterday, I'm going to make a pitch for ecological history. I was very much appreciated Ken comments along those lines. I want to particularly address Megan Vaughn's point. She says, why are not huge inland transformations within Africa considered part of global history? I think it's an excellent question. I mentioned yesterday that Alfred Crosby said, I don't know whether it's true, but he said that the American plant's impact on Africa were greater than any place on the planet. I want to switch examples to something that Jared Diamond said in Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's a very couple of sentences is all. But he made the point that the sweet potato coming through Manila into New Guinea, which he knows quite a lot about, in the highlands of New Guinea caused the doubling of the population of New Guinea and a reorganization of their societies. So I don't know enough about the African case, but I suspect that the American plants, these inland connections, these are connections, but they don't necessarily reflect themselves in external trade along the coast as stated, are every bit as a major part of world history, for sure. And so I just want to end by saying that an essential avenue for inclusion of parts of the world, including gigantic Africa, that have been excluded is via ecological and epidemiological history. They're connected. And economic history should not limit itself just to the pork trade and the external connections of that sort.
Thank you very much. I think we might take one more question. Is there an urgent one? Oh, there's two. Oh. Okay. No, you go ahead.
I'm William Clarence Smith from SOAS. One thing on comparisons, I think we want to not just compare Africa to other thinly populated areas. I mean, I think comparing northern Nigeria to the Yamsi Delta, to Bengal, to Java would actually be just as important. But my main point is about professionalisation, and here's very important points which I don't want to lose sight of. There are PhD programs now in the States in global history, and so PhD students are being put through the kind of archival mangle in some cases. I'm myself working on a project on rubber in the Second World War, which is a kind of example where you have a very concentrated topic where you can use archives for a truly global topic. Coming back to something people are saying, you can't have a global topic which covers the world. I think you actually can. And I think that this also relates back to Pierre's point about us as public intellectuals. I think we do need to justify what we do in terms of impact in the new jargon of academic administration in this country.
Well, I think as you were so quick, I think we can fit time in it too.
I'm Simon Screech, also from SOAS. I didn't really want to ask the last question because I'm going to interject some dubiousness about and I wanted to ask people who define themselves as global historians, what is left out? What cannot be covered by global history? Because we've heard a lot about what we add to existing sorts of history by global history. What are we going to lose? Because there must be something that has to go to bring so much extra in. And I just wondered whether that might be something like this. That I happen to do Japan, that's all I can do. I don't know anything about anything else. But its intrinsic difference is something which I think is of importance to anyone, to know that society can be intrinsically entirely different. It doesn't matter whether Japan, doesn't matter if it's Nigeria, and its non-linkages with us are things which I think are extremely important. Japan has possibly a unique situation of being very much linked in today, and having been extremely unlinked in for most parts of its history. I would not want to get to the point where it's only the moments when we, however we define that, we interpose ourselves in another civilization, that other civilization becomes then a moment of interest to us. And I think Craig clearly said yesterday over coffee, that for 98% of Chinese people at all times of history, including the present, the West is completely irrelevant. So I'm sorry to end on that note, but I think it's something which perhaps could be considered.
Well, I think all these questions deserve a great deal more than the time we have, but I think it would be worthwhile hearing from all of you if you'd be willing just to have a quick reply or a comment
it's extremely complicated to give an answer to all
Make
these
sure you have
questions.
a microphone.
I think it's extremely complicated to give an answer to all these questions. The only thing I would want to say is that I really think that professionalization, because there have to be standards. There's a lot of global historians are attacked for not being professional enough, and the only thing you can do about it is getting more professional. So there have to be standards, and there have to be a kind of rules, and we have to take care of institutionalization. I'm not a neoclassical or an institutionalist, but if you don't have an organization, it's elderly people like Patrick O'Brien doing global history, but not having a real job for it. John McNeill, or William McNeill, was a brilliant global historian, but when he left, he had no successor. Pat Manning did a beautiful job, but the Northeastern Institute was closed. Without institutionalization, there's a danger that it's a hobby.
Well, let me try to address the issue of religion and economic development. It's not a new idea to link religion and underdevelopment, economic development. It goes a long way back to Weber and certainly earlier. And there used to be many religions were identified as causing underdevelopment. But over time, evidence has suggested that all of these were wrong. For example, economic development was considered incompatible with Catholicism, okay, with many Asian religions. And now it persists with Islam. And one of the things I would say, one of the, let's say, empirically troubling things about this is the idea that somehow in this vast geography from the Atlantic to East Asia, that there has been no change over the last millennium and a half. That religion and institutions in these societies have remained frozen. And basically, that is the argument. When you make the argument that Islam has caused economic underdevelopment, then you'd have to argue that these societies are really incapable of changing their institutions, their ways. In fact, when you look there, you see enormous diversity in this geography. From Morocco to Indonesia, there are wide-ranging practices, institutions, rules. So, religion should be part of global history. I would welcome that. But I think the connection between religion and underdevelopment or economic development is often the wrong connection. On the issue of institutions, I am more in favor of an agenda that would look at the influences and the direction of influences on the evolution of institutions. But as I think later North also agrees, there is no such thing as efficient institutions or single efficient institutions.
The new book still is basically.
And if we look at the present day world, we see that in fact there are many possibilities of institutions that may lead to economic development. Say, somebody like Danny Rodrik has been emphasizing that the recipe for economic development is not only the Western European way. Say, East Asian institutions are very, very different, but they have been very successful. So it's the multiplicity and the interaction I would emphasize rather than the single path.
Okay, perhaps just 3 points. I mean, I think the first is the point that that Pierre raised. That is, how do we professionalize and institutionalize global history? I think that is very difficult, but I suspect actually by far the most subtle and insidious way in which we can do it is by insisting upon injecting, as it were, a global dimension, a global way of thinking into all sorts of other fields. And I'm a kind of recidivist imperial historian who realized that you had to inject, as well, some dimension of global history into what I was doing. And I think actually that is one of the best ways altogether, in fact, of making this something which people simply cannot ignore. It's by, as well, making it a pandemic, you might say. Whether there's a way of creating departments of global history or even professorships of global history, I think is much more doubtful. Secondly, on terms of method, it doesn't seem to me that we should be particularly apologetic about the fact that our methodology is inevitably rather messy. I mean, after all, I suppose, particularly if you're trying to construct larger syntheses, inevitably you fall back upon the traditional methods of the historian, which is triangulation. You attempt to discover more or less reliable sources of fields and topics that you don't know yourself very much about. But that is true, after all, of the whole range of historical fields. And perhaps if we have a comparative advantage over other fields, it may be that global historians are of necessity more like jacks of all trade than some other fields have had to be. It's perhaps an advantage. Perhaps that's all I need to say. Thank you.
I think a number of... is that working? No. I think a number of interesting points have been raised, but I think it's actually a bit late in the day to engage in an extended discussion of how Africa fits into this global history, and I can't think of anything of global significance to say at this moment, so I am going to pass.
I just want to echo Alkin's concern about Douglas North's sort of theory. I know that that is one of the image of Douglas North's theory. That is one model, basically the Western, sort of European American model, and everybody is I know that image, but I'm not a Douglas North follower. I'm not trying to defend for that position, because you do find that kind of lines in his writing, in particular recent ones. But we go back to the 1990s. Some of his work, actually, I found it very, very inspiring in the sense that actually he talk about not just formal institutions. That's really, very, very Western. He also talk about informal institutions. He also talk about enforcement characteristics. These things are not necessary. You can't think about that as in the Western context. Now the question is, thereafter, very little elaboration on that from Douglas North himself, as if he always abandoned that, the informal institution. But in the 90s, his theory is so, how I say, very systematic. Formal institution, informal institution, and their enforcement characteristics put together, three things put together, and then you talk about efficiency and all the other things. So that means, I don't know, if you go back to the 90s and go back to those things and get that idea back and try to examine the different cultures and all these things that we're talking about in the comparisons and so forth, I think probably it's still some kind of, I think it's still useful in certain sense.
Well, the last, only a very brief word about institutions and also networks. I mean, I take it from my field. I mean, the history of European empires during the early modern period. What strikes me is sometimes the confusion that some people do regarding the use of state institutions or legal institutions and networks. Actually, I think that it's very inspiring. I mean, what Naomi Lamru and some of her colleagues wrote about the difference between transactions, networks, and on last level, institutions. And what I'm finding, I mean, regarding the Portuguese Empire, but sometimes also the Dutch Empire, is a kind of confusion between what is a network and what is an empire based on a series of state institutions that were pioneer regarding the development of a colonial state. And this is a problem that, and the discussion that is going on, I mean, in the field. And I think that, for instance, the book, the wonderful book by Karen Ward on networks of empire regarding the Dutch forced migration in Batavia and in South Africa relaunched that kind of debate from a Dutch point of view, which I think that is a very interesting thing.
Well, I think we have reached the end of our session, so I think we should thank our panelists here. And then I'm sure Maxine would like the last word, but just before she does that, Giorgio and I have operated just next to Maxine, seeing her prepare for this, and she has cared a great deal and put a lot of effort into this. And symbolically, on behalf of all of you, Giorgio and I wanted to thank Maxine.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Well, I just want to say how grateful I am to be able to have held this conference at the British Academy. I organized a conference that was to be held here on July the 7th to 8th, 2005. And as you will all recall, that was the day when a lot of people died or were terribly injured, and London came to a standstill. Well, we did hold a conference because the glorious French came through. Somebody came from Italy, somebody came from Ireland, and I cancelled the conference, but I had to reconstitute it, and I did so in Oxford. So we did meet, and other people came in to very quickly, such as Margaret Finn came in and gave a paper, Parton Mitter gave a paper. So some people who had gone home or hadn't made it, we did hold the conference, but it was in very sad circumstances. So I'm just very grateful that we have got to this point after these 2 days, and we managed to hold our conference here. And I'm especially grateful to, well, any conference. And I think this has been a really good conference. What it really relies on is the team that helps organize it, and I want to thank Angela Pusey and her team. And our film team, who've been at the back or filming some of you in little sessions. They have done a great, really great job of this. And I'm particularly grateful to Giorgio